Hi, this is Yanina from Ukraine. 5 things from Ukraine you're 100% familiar with. These are things you surely know very well, but you probably don't realize it's somehow related to Ukraine. Popularity of coffee. Interesting fact: Ukrainian Cossacks popularized coffee in Europe. Coffee was distributed among the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Ukraine. It was the Crimeans who taught the Ukrainian Cossacks to drink coffee. If you don't know, Ukrainian Cossacks were skilled warriors who lived in democratic, self-organized communities. One of the most famous Cossack leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, drank coffee and treated his guests with it. So, from the Crimean name of the drink, kava, its name came to other languages of Eastern and Central Europe. In Ukraine, it's kava. Yuri Kulchitsky, who was born in the modern Lviv region of Ukraine, distributed coffee further west, namely in Vienna. Kulchitsky was also a Cossack. In 1683, when the Ottoman Empire attacked Vienna, Kulchitsky used his knowledge of the Turkish language to save the city. As a reward from the king, he asked only for bags full of coffee of the Ottoman army, and eventually opened the first cafe in Vienna. At the time, coffee shops already existed in some places in Europe, but were not really popular. Kulchitsky actively promoted coffee and began to add sugar to it, inventing the so-called Viennese coffee. Thanks to his efforts, the drink has become very popular, as well as the Kulchitsky Cafe. He contributed to the opening of many other cafes in the city. Immunity, disinfection, cholera and plague vaccine. Before COVID-19, humanity faced much more deadly diseases, among them famous and horrifying plague and cholera. And scientists, thanks to whom we overcame those diseases, were from Ukraine. In particular, they worked at what we now call Odessa Medical University. So, what we now know as immunity was discovered by Ilya Mechnikov from Kharkiv region, who worked in Odessa. He received the Nobel Prize, and further discoveries were made by his students. One of that is disinfection measures that we even use today. It was developed by microbiologist Mykola Hamaliya, who was born in Odessa and came from a noble Cossack family, Hamaliyas. He opened and headed the world's first bacteriological station in Odessa. Another scientist from Vinnytsia region who worked in Odessa, Danilo Zabolotny, proved that the plague is transmitted by rats and pointed out the need for deratization. He traveled to India, China, across Europe, where the plague raged, studying cholera, and proved that it's possible to vaccinate against it orally. Another student of Mechnikov, using all the previous discoveries, and invented plague and cholera vaccines. Vladimir Havkin struggled building his career in the Russian Empire because of his political activity, but mostly because he was Ukrainian Jewish. And Jews in Russian Empire were officially restricted in many ways. Therefore, being a promising microbiologist, he was able to work only in the Zoological Museum. So, even after he moved to Paris, being invited by Mechnikov, who also left the Russian Empire due to the pressure, and after he developed a cholera vaccine, in 1892, the world medical community didn't believe the young scientist, and no one agreed to buy his vaccine. Finally, the British Empire allowed to use out the vaccine, but only in colonies, namely in India. Colonialism as it is. So, Havkin worked in Calcutta, where the epidemic was rampant. He then went to Bombay, where was the epidemic of plague, and not only invented the plague vaccine, but successfully organized the vaccination of 4 million people. Interesting fact: there are research or educational institutes named after everyone I've just mentioned. Mechnikov in Odessa, Zabolotny in Kyiv, Hamaliya in Moscow, and Havkin in Mumbai. Again, colonialism as it is. One of the most popular classic Christmas melody. Interesting fact: this song supposed to popularize Ukrainian culture, but instead it became famous with lyrics in English. Originally, it's a song written by a Ukrainian composer and based on the Ukrainian folk song. You probably know it as A Carol of the Bells.
Christmas is here, bringing good cheer to young
Actually, it's Щедрик. The folk song Щедрик is not exactly the Christmas song. It's one of the songs traditionally performed during the New Year's Eve. Its original folk lyrics is about a little swallow that flew and started to sing, because its roots going back to pre-Christian times, when New Year was celebrating at spring. But how Щедрик became Carol of the Bells? So, the Ukrainian composer Mykola Leontovich wrote this arrangement to the folk song in 1914. A few years later, Ukraine was able to gain independence for a short time. To promote Ukrainian culture abroad, Ukrainian government was organized the concert tour of Ukrainian Republic Capella. It was a very successful tour. The song Щедрик was introduced to audiences in 45 main cities of Europe, North and South Americas. In the United States, it was premiered in 1922 at Carnegie Hall. And only 14 years from that moment, more famous English lyrics were written by Peter Wilhołowski, American composer of Ukrainian ethnicity. Wilhołowski published the song and copyrighted the lyrics in the USA. It became popular as Carol of the Bells. At that point, Ukraine was already a part of USSR, and Carol of the Bells wasn't known in Ukraine until the 90s. Modern knapsack parachute. Interesting fact: the parachute was invented by the actor. Gleb Kotelnikov was born in St. Petersburg, but his parents were from Poltava, Ukraine. It was in Poltava that he spent his youth and began his career as an amateur actor. He had two main hobbies in life: theater and construction of inventions. In 1910, Kotelnikov began to develop a parachute. This happened under the impression of the tragic death of the pilot Lev Matsievich, by the way, the first aviator of Ukrainian origin and Ukrainian politician. So Kotelnikov decided to prevent such terrible accidents with pilot in the future. At that time, Kotelnikov already was a professional actor in St. Petersburg. According to legend, one day Kotelnikov accidentally saw a lady in the theater taking a large silk shawl from a small bag and realized that thin silk is the best material for a parachute, which can be compactly folded. In December 1911, Kotelnikov tried to register this invention in Russian Empire, but for unknown reason didn't receive a patent. So he patented the parachute in France. This parachute was used during the First World War, and it's the basis of the modern one. Contribution in Conquer the Space. Interesting fact: most of the scientists were working as prisoners. The launch of the first man into space was led by Ukrainian Serhiy Korolev, who was born in Zhytomyr. At the time, nothing was known about him in the world, because this information was a state secret. And he himself worked in the Labor Camp Design Bureau, a gulag prison where you are on fictitious political charge and engage in research by force, Soviet Union as it is. After World War II, Serhiy Korolev was appointed chief designer of ballistic missiles. In 1956, he headed the largest missile center in the USSR. Under his leadership, the intercontinental rocket was successfully launched, as well as the first artificial satellite of Earth, and 5 years later, the first human flight into space. The engines for those missiles were designed by Valentin Glushko, who was born in Odessa. He also worked as prisoner. The engines were mainly developed for nuclear-powered ballistic missiles, but they were also used in the first satellite and the first rocket in which man flew into space. Yuri Kondratyuk, a native of Poltava, real name Alexander Shargey, developed the optimal trajectory of the flight from the Earth to the Moon, which was named Kondratyuk's Road. He had to change his name for fear of being killed by the Bolsheviks, and also worked in the Labor Camp Design Bureau. As early as 1916, he described a multi-stage space rocket and interplanetary spacecraft. In 1929, he published his ideas in the book The Conquest of Interplanetary Space. In it, author describes the road to the moon. This book, with Kondratyk's calculation, was successfully used by NASA 40 years later when astronauts landed on the moon. So, from many of the stories you can realize why you didn't know something or someone is from Ukraine. When the nation don't have its own country, but being a colony, it's not surprising. Talented people from Ukraine sometimes had to work in the capital of the empire because it gave them the only opportunity to be successful, or they could be forced to work for the government, or they immigrated because of the persecution and threat to their lives. And don't forget about cultural appropriation, which is carried out mainly by Russia, when prominent personalities are considered Russians because they were citizens of the Russian Empire and the USSR. However, the social institutions inherent in the different cultural environments here in Ukraine are important. It's not only about ethnic Ukrainians, but also about Crimean Tatars, Jews, Poles and other peoples live in Ukraine for centuries. Thank you for your interest in Ukraine. Please subscribe to this channel and put thumb up under this video.